When we talk about human anatomy or getting a medical diagnosis, there's usually this underlying expectation of, I don't know, simple mechanics.
Oh, absolutely. Like a machine.
Right. Think of a car engine. You get a flat tire, the car limps along, the mechanic points to the puncture and is just like, there's your problem.
Yeah, it's a very localized, very predictable event.
Exactly. You swap the part out and the machine just runs again. But when you step into the world of the female reproductive system,
Mm,
that simple mechanical model just completely falls apart.
it really does. It's not a single localized engine at all.
No. We're looking at what is essentially a highly sensitive full-body weather system. It's this complex, interconnected network where, a minor shift in your brain chemistry can just completely shut down your pelvic organs.
Or where a system that's functioning perfectly normally can cause a debilitating localized pain.
Yeah, which is wild to think about.
It is. And historically, medicine has treated it as an isolated plumbing issue, which completely misses that systemic reality. Treating the uterus or the ovaries as separate from, the brain or the bones or the cardiovascular system.
It just leads to a profound misunderstanding of how the body actually operates.
Exactly.
So today we are taking a deep dive into the clinical realities of that exact weather system, from the very first pulse of hormones to the final hot flash. And we're using Robin Webb Corbett's text, Clinical Management of Menstrual Disorders and Menopause, as our guide to really give you a profound understanding of this.
And we aren't just going to look at the mechanics of the cycle. We really want to explore the why. Like, why do these physiological shifts have such massive whole body implications for you?
Okay, let's unpack this. How does a system that relies on such a delicate chemical tightrope between the brain and the ovaries end up dictating so much of a person's biological life?
Well, we have to look at the baseline calibration first, because the menstrual cycle isn't just, it's not a 28-day timer located in the pelvis.
Right.
It's actually driven by this continuous delicate feedback loop that starts deep in the brain. The hypothalamus releases a hormone called GnRH,
Okay.
but it doesn't just release it all at once. It pulses it out in a highly specific rhythm. And that rhythmic pulse signals the pituitary gland to release FSH and LH.
And those are the hormones that travel through the bloodstream, right?
Exactly. They travel down to tell the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone.
And, when that loop gets going, which is usually around age 12 or so, it takes a really long time to actually settle into a rhythm.
It's definitely not instantaneous.
No. Corbett's text notes that it takes about 15 months just to complete the first 10 cycles, and an average of 20 cycles before a young woman even ovulates regularly.
Yeah, it's not a switch that just flips on perfectly.
It's a massive biological system booting up. And it requires a highly specific environment to keep running, doesn't it?
It really does. And when it stops entirely, barring pregnancy, the secondary causes reveal just how sensitive this brain-ovary loop really is to survival conditions.
Like the body fat requirements.
Yes, a body needs at least 17% adipose tissue, so fat, just to initiate menstruation, and 22% to maintain it regularly.
I was thinking about this adipose threshold like a smartphone's strict power saving mode.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, like if the battery is running critically low, whether that's due to starvation or intense psychological stress or that extreme physical training you see in sports like gymnastics or distance running.
The female athlete triad.
Exactly. The brain assesses the situation and starts force closing background apps. Reproduction is basically a luxury the body can't afford, so it shuts down the hypothalamic pulses.
Right. No GnRH pulse means no ovarian stimulation, and the entire system just goes dormant.
But wait, if the body is doing this to protect itself from a pregnancy it physically can't handle, why does the text detail such severe bone loss consequences for these young athletes?
Yeah,
Is this power-saving mode actually protecting the body, or is it actively harming it? Because it sounds like the body is destroying itself to save itself.
what's fascinating here is the double-edged sword of this biological response. So by shutting down ovarian function, the body is completely starved of estrogen.
Right.
And estrogen isn't just a reproductive hormone, it's the primary chemical signal telling the skeletal system to hold on to its calcium.
Wow.
So without it, the loss of calcium in a young amenorrheic athlete, someone who has lost her period, closely parallels what we see in a postmenopausal woman.
So they're essentially experiencing premature osteoporosis in their teens or 20s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which perfectly explains the devastating stress fractures we see in elite female athletes.
Man, a survival mechanism in the brain ends up hollowing out the skeleton. That is a heavy, heavy biological trade-off.
It really is.
But let's build on this idea of the body's internal defenses. We just looked at what happens when the system shuts down to survive. The flip side is what happens when the system functions entirely normally, but inflicts just immense debilitating pain in the process.
Right. Dysmenorrhea.
Yeah. Why does a routine biological process hurt so much?
Well, clinically, we divide this pain into two camps. Primary dysmenorrhea is pain without any underlying pelvic pathology.
So nothing is technically wrong or broken.
Right. It's just the body's natural ovulatory cycle doing exactly what it's supposed to do, but doing it aggressively. And the secondary dysmenorrhea means there's a physical pathology actively causing the pain.
The clinical explanation for primary dysmenorrhea is wild to me. The text points to this specific prostaglandin, PGF2.
Yes, PGF2.
When the uterine lining sheds, excessive amounts of this chemical are released, and it causes the uterus to contract violently, triggering severe vasospasm in the uterine arterioles.
The blood vessels are literally clamping shut.
Yeah, they're cutting off the oxygen supply to the surrounding muscle tissue. So if prostaglandins are causing the blood vessels to spasm and induce ischemia, or severe menstrual cramps, essentially localized mini heart attacks of the uterus.
That is a vivid analogy, but it's incredibly accurate.
Wow.
Ischemia, which is that acute lack of oxygenated blood flow to the muscle tissue, that causes that deep, gripping, breathless pain in both a myocardial infarction and in severe primary dysmenorrhea.
So if you've ever wondered why a heating pad is, like, the only thing that works for those clamps, it's because you're literally fighting a localized lack of oxygen, trying to force those vessels back open with heat.
Exactly. And the thing is, PGF2 doesn't just stay localized in the uterus.
Oh, right, it travels.
Yeah, it seeps into the systemic circulation. That's what triggers the backache, the weakness, sweating, and gastrointestinal issues like vomiting and diarrhea. It's a full-body inflammatory cascade.
Which completely validates the 15% of women who report their pain is so severe it limits their ability to function or work.
Absolutely. And then you add the complex neuroendocrine responses on top of that, like PMS and PMDD.
Right, and the text makes it clear those aren't just mood swings.
No, not at all. Premenstrual syndrome and premenstrual dysphoric disorder are distinct medical syndromes tied directly to the luteal phase of the cycle. We're looking at a complex interplay between cyclic estrogen fluctuations and serotonin levels in the brain.
So when serotonin, which helps us cope with stress, is destabilized by these hormonal shifts, you see severe physical and psychological symptoms.
Right. It requires ovarian function to occur, but the mechanism is deeply rooted in brain chemistry.
And then there's secondary dysmenorrhea, where the pain is driven by a physical pathology, specifically endometriosis.
Yes.
Where endometrial tissue, which is highly specialized tissue that belongs strictly inside the uterus, somehow grows outside of it. Like the text mentions it growing on the ovaries, creating these chocolate cysts filled with old dark blood, or growing on the bowels and the bladder. How is it physically migrating there?
Well, one of the most widely accepted clinical models is retrograde menstruation.
Okay, what is that?
The theory is that during a period, instead of all the tissue exiting the cervix, some of it flows backward through the uterine tubes, spilling out into the peritoneal cavity.
Wait, really? It just flows backward?
Yeah. Now, most immune systems clean this up using macrophages. But in some women, this tissue evades the immune system, implants on other organs, and just seeds itself.
And because it's endometrial tissue, it still responds to the monthly hormonal signals from the brain.
Exactly. So when the ovaries signal the uterus to grow tissue and bleed, these rogue patches on the bowels or the bladder, they also grow and bleed internally with nowhere for the blood to go.
Jeez, that trapped blood has to trigger a massive inflammatory response.
It does. Over time, it causes fibrosis and internal adhesions. The organs can literally fuse together.
Wow. So how do you treat that?
Well, the primary medical goal is starving that misplaced tissue of estrogen.
Using medications like GnRH agonists, right?
Yeah, right. We use drugs to continually stimulate and then ultimately suppress the pituitary gland. It stops the ovaries from working altogether, which induces a temporary medical menopause.
So the misplaced tissue shrinks from the lack of estrogen.
Yes, but the patient now has to navigate menopausal side effects like hot flashes and bone loss, often in their 20s or 30s.
That is just, wow. So we've seen how estrogen and progesterone signals drive tissue growth and pain. But what happens when those chemical signals or the physical plumbing they act upon just misfire and cause abnormal bleeding?
That brings us to how clinical medicine categorizes abnormal uterine bleeding, using the acronym POLIMCOM.
Poncovone.
Yes, it beautifully divides the bleeding etiologies into structural issues and non-structural issues.
So what does this all mean? I was looking at this like troubleshooting a leaky
Oh,
house.
yeah, I like that.
If water is pouring through your ceiling, you have to figure out the source, right? So the pollen side represents the structural issues. A physical pipe has burst.
Right, polyp, adenomyosis, leiomyoma, and malignancy. These are physical masses or anatomical changes fundamentally altering the architecture of the uterus.
And then the COEN side represents the non-structural issues, the software glitches. It's like the smart home system is suddenly turning all the faucets on high pressure.
Exactly. Coagulopathy, ovulatory dysfunction, endometrial issues, iatrogenic causes like medications, and not classified.
Let's dig into the L in palm, leiomyoma, or fibroids. The prevalence in the text just stopped me in my tracks.
That's incredibly common.
By age 50, 70% of white women and over 80% of black women will develop these benign, smooth muscle tumors. How does a fibroid actually cause such heavy bleeding?
Well, fibroids physically distort the uterine cavity. First, they massively increase the surface area of the endometrium, meaning there's simply more tissue that grows and sheds each month.
Okay, that makes sense.
And second, they interfere with the uterus's mechanical ability to contract effectively. Normal uterine contractions actually help pinch off the bleeding blood vessels during a period. But a rigid tumor blocking that contraction means the bleeding just continues unchecked.
Right, so you can't treat a structural pipe issue the same way you treat a software issue.
This raises an important question about treatment, yes.
Because if you have an ovulatory dysfunction on the co-EIN side, the text says you might use high-dose and NSAIDs to alter the prostaglandin levels and reduce blood loss. Or oral contraceptives to force the hormones back into a regulated rhythm.
Exactly. But if you have a physical mass like a fibroid, you can't just reboot the software. For severe, life-disrupting bleeding caused by fibroids, we have to look at highly targeted structural management.
Like surgery.
Yes, like a myomectomy to physically excise the tumors from the uterine wall. Or a procedure called uterine artery embolization, where we intentionally block the specific blood vessels feeding the fibroids with microparticles, basically starving them of oxygen until they shrink.
Wow. We've just seen the chaos that ensues when estrogen and progesterone signals misfire. But what happens when the ovaries simply run out of the cellular hardware needed to receive those signals at all?
That brings us to the permanent shift. Perimenopause and menopause. The body's software begins to permanently change its programming.
Clinically, menopause is defined strictly in retrospect, right? 12 consecutive months without a menstrual cycle. The average age is around 51.
Right. But the real physiological event is perimenopause, the transition period.
The text describes it as a 4 to 8 year roller coaster preceding that final period.
Roller coaster is accurate. During this time, the ovarian follicles become less and less sensitive to FSH and LH. The brain is effectively screaming at the ovaries to produce an egg flooding the systemic circulation with FSH, but the ovaries are just running out of viable follicles to respond.
Which creates wildly fluctuating estrogen levels and ovulatory cycles, and eventually this profound systemic drop in estrogen production.
And when you pull that estrogen out of the body, the withdrawal symptoms are intense. Vasomotor instability affects up to 75% of women.
We know those as hot flashes and night sweats. What is actually happening in the brain to cause a hot flash?
So the sudden lack of estrogen essentially glitches the hypothalamus, which acts as the body's internal thermostat. The brain suddenly perceives the core body temperature as dangerously high, even when it isn't.
Oh, wow.
So it triggers massive, inappropriate vasodilation, opening up the blood vessels near the skin, and profuse sweating to dump this non-existent excess heat.
Along with the hot flashes, there's genitourinary syndrome, where the lack of estrogen causes the vaginal tissues to thin out, lose moisture, and change their pH, which invites recurring urinary tract infections. It's just a cascade of physical stressors.
It really is.
But I want to pull on a specific thread regarding the psychological symptoms. The text points out that in cultures where older postmenopausal women actively gain status and respect, like in India or the South Pacific Islands, depression during menopause is rarely observed. Does this mean the psychological crisis of menopause we hear so much about in the West is actually just a cultural construct rather than a biological certainty?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it perfectly illustrates the intersection of biology and sociology. The physical vasodilation of a hot flash or the thinning of the vaginal wall, that's pure, undeniable biology driven by low estrogen.
Right.
But how a person psychologically copes with those physical stressors is deeply tied to their cultural support system.
Yeah.
If society dictates your value is tied to youth and reproductive capacity, the end of that capacity is going to trigger a psychological crisis.
But if society tells you you're stepping into an era of wisdom and elevated status, your psychological resilience is far stronger.
Exactly. And biology also offers some unexpected physical buffers, too. The text noted that obese women often experience fewer menopausal hot flashes
Why is that?
because adipose tissue contains an enzyme called aromatase, which can take androgens produced by the adrenal glands and convert them into estrone, which is a type of estrogen.
Wait, so fat cells essentially act as a small, natural backup estrogen reserve.
Basically, yes. The peripheral conversion of androgens provides a slight buffer against that massive estrogen drop, though, as the text warns, this unopposed estrogen also increases the risk of endometrial hyperplasia.
Mhm.
Biology rarely gives a free lunch.
No kidding. So once a woman makes it through that 4 to 8 year roller coaster and goes 12 months without a period, she is officially postmenopausal.
Yes,
The body enters a new permanent baseline, completely stripped of its protective estrogen shield. And here is where the real invisible risks accelerate. We move from managing acute discomfort to managing long-term morbidity.
the two massive silent threats in the postmenopausal reality are osteoporosis and coronary heart disease.
Let's start with the bones, because we touched on this earlier with the athlete triad.
Wow.
Estrogen normally stimulates osteoblasts, which are the specific cells that build new bone scaffolding.
Right, and it also converts vitamin D into calcitonin, helping the gut absorb calcium.
So when estrogen disappears, that entire assembly line just shuts down.
Exactly. The osteoclasts, the cells responsible for breaking down old bone, they keep working at their normal pace, but the osteoblasts stop rebuilding. Old bone deteriorates faster than new bone is formed.
And the microscopic architecture of the bone thins out, creating a highly porous, fragile skeleton. The stat was, what, 50% of women over age 50 will break a bone due to osteoporosis?
Yes, 50%. 1 in 2 women.
Unbelievable. And then there's a cardiovascular system. Estrogen acts as a cardiovascular shield during the reproductive years, keeping LDL cholesterol low and HDL high.
It has a direct anti-atherosclerotic effect on the arteries. It actively prevents plaque buildup. But once menopause hits, that lipid metabolism flips and coronary heart disease risk skyrockets.
It becomes the leading cause of death.
It does. And this is exactly why menopausal hormone therapy, or MHT, is a critical clinical tool. The guidelines in the text support therapy for the right candidates. Use the lowest effective dose for the shortest possible time to control symptoms.
And crucially, it should ideally be started before age 60 or within 10 years of menopause onset to maximize the cardiovascular and skeletal protective window.
That timing is incredibly important.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When people talk about hormone therapy today, there's a massive push for bioidentical or custom compounded hormones. The marketing promises something natural and mixed just for you.
Oh yes, the custom compounding trend.
Reading the clinical warnings, I couldn't help but compare custom compounding to, like, artisanal baking.
That analogy holds up very well. I mean, it sounds wonderful and bespoke. But if you're baking a cake without standardized measurements, you have absolutely no idea how much yeast or sugar you're getting in each bite compared to a rigorously tested, FDA-approved recipe.
Exactly. And they often base these custom mixtures on saliva testing, don't they?
They do, and salivary hormone levels fluctuate wildly from day to day and even hour to hour. Basing a daily medical prescription on a single saliva swab is highly unreliable and potentially risky. If a patient wants bioidentical hormones, meaning the molecular structure exactly matches what the human ovary produces, there are plenty of well-tested, FDA-approved brand name prescriptions available that guarantee consistent dosing and predictable systemic absorption.
The text also hammers home the lifestyle non-negotiables to fight off this post-menopausal vulnerability. Weight-bearing exercise, like walking or stair climbing, actively forces the bones to maintain their density through mechanical stress.
You also need a daily intake of 1,200 milligrams of calcium, paired with vitamin D.
Right, you have to actively give the body the raw materials and the physical stress signals to keep rebuilding itself.
You're actively managing an entirely new physiological state.
We've journeyed from the first pulse of GnRH in the brain of a 12-year-old, through the mechanical failures of abnormal bleeding and the visceral pain of dysmenorrhea, all the way to the final hot flashes and the ongoing defense of the postmenopausal heart and skeleton. Understanding this intricate, lifelong biological timeline equips you to profoundly advocate for your own health, or to deeply understand and support the women in your life who are navigating these invisible internal shifts.
And, before we wrap up, there was one detail in Corbett's text I just cannot stop thinking about.
Oh, what's that?
We talked extensively about endometriosis as a pelvic issue,
Mm-hmm.
but researchers have documented endometrial tissue growing in the lungs and even on the heart.
Wait, on the heart.
Yes. Think about that for a moment. Tissue that is fundamentally reproductive, bleeding in rhythm with the monthly cycle, but doing so within the respiratory or cardiovascular systems.
That is wild.
If these tissues can travel to and operate within the very engines of breath and blood, perhaps we must completely stop thinking of the female reproductive system as a localized, isolated set of pelvic organs. It is a systemic, body-wide network that has the power to influence every single beat of our hearts and every breath in our lungs.
That is a staggering reality to consider. It really is an all-encompassing system. Well, thank you for joining us today, for bringing your curiosity and for diving into the magnificent, muddy waters of human biology with us. Until next time.